We'll get the round underway. I'm very happy to invite the Prime Minister to speak to the motion standing in their name. Hear.
Please ask POIs in the chat as usual. International law and international organizations are currently functioning as a global superstate in disguise, which impact us more than arbitrary borders, but that we are powerless to influence under the status quo. Our case is going to be that this is morally terrible and practically disastrous. Before that, though, a couple pieces of characterization. Firstly, we reject any kind of notion of universal morality that exists under the status quo. I think that the counterfactual would likely be the belief that there can be multiple kinds of moral systems that can exist. Secondly, this would also exist on the practical level if we would not have international organizations like the ICC, but we are fine with things like regional courts that would exist or regional trade-based organizations. I'm also going to prove why those are likely to actually emerge. First major claim then, why is our world a lot more morally preferable? I want to forward two independent principles. The first is similar to a democratic principle that exists under the status quo, which is that all international norms exert huge coercive power over the kind of life that we live, and we allow comparatively more accountability structures under our side of a house. I think that moral systems and international organizations impact us in a variety of different ways. I think that it engages in implicit moral commentary over the kind of things that we are saying that we as a global community ultimately support. International law tends to be incredibly prescriptive in nature, where in a similar way to how the state justice system works, if you do things that violate international law, you are subject to prosecution in things like international courts. International organizations are literally funded by our own labor because by extension, they are funded by national budgets, which is literally a product of choices that individual people make within the state. International organizations also uniquely constrain the policy choices of national governments as well. So things like my own economic policy in which I vote under are constrained by things like what the WTO says I'm allowed to do as a state overall. So therefore, particularly in an increasingly globalized world, there's a super state that exists under the status quo, but right now, individuals are not able to influence that. I think that the reason that we have a right to be able to influence these things is that individuals are owed a reparative obligation because there is a moral wrong when a coercive entity tries to constrain the choices that you are making in a particular kind of way. The reason for this is I just think that there exists a basic moral principle that I deserve control over my individual quality of life, given the fact that I was born, I am stuck in my own body, and only I know the preferences that I actually have. So given that this kind of system then constrains my potential for self-actualization, the most important thing is the maximization of control within that system. Under our side of the house, individuals have comparatively more influence at the national, at the regional, and at the local level in a variety of different ways. So if you are not happy with things like your state's legal system, you're better able to lobby your own government to change its legal code than to try and lobby an entire legal system. There's absolutely no incentive to be responsive to you whatsoever. Even when it comes to things like regional-based organizations, you have comparatively more control over other governments that are located in closer proximity to you, where you have more soft power mechanisms. And if you have more trade ties, you're able to threaten things like boycotts to a larger extent. So given the fact that the pond in which you're trying to influence is a lot smaller, it basically just makes you a bigger fish, chains of accountability structures are just a lot more clear in that capacity. The second principle that we want to forward is just the classic one of epistemic humility and there being no objective kind of morality that exists. Given that there is not God, I do not think that an op team can definitively prove that there is an a priori correct moral system that ultimately exists. I think you then create an inherent moral evil by attempting to create a series of universalized laws which effectively say that one individual's conception of morality that happens to just be the most powerful hegemon in history is more inherently deserving of global recognition than other kinds of moral systems. This is an active moral harm because laws are not morally neutral. Laws are something that are making an explicit statement over the kind of things that we as a human race ultimately want to be able to engage in conduct in. I think the response to this can be, but what about grossly immoral things like forms of war crimes, blah, blah, blah. And often to be we want a convergence to good kinds of global morality. Our claim is that regional moral systems are still going to broadly form in pretty good ways. The first that I think that individuals have innate kinds of empathy that exist in the vast majority of cases. Number one, we often experience forms of suffering within our own life, and therefore we can conceptualize, I do not want to be subjected to a horrible kind of war crime. Therefore, I'm more likely to create a kind of moral system, even from a self-interested standpoint, to protect myself and other people against that. I also think that due to evolutionary biases, we actually do evolve in relatively moral ways, given that you often have to have a level of reliance of other people within your own tribe to ward off the forces of nature, and therefore we do actually have empathetic biases. I also think that if moral systems are too brutal, people are not going to opt into them, therefore they're going to be relatively good. Before then I move into the practical stuff, I'd love to take a POI from back half.
So the implication of your principle is the delegation of sovereignty is bad. Insofar as states function a willful delegation of sovereignty to coercive power, which creates the same type of asymmetry of fear, your counterfactual is more as a corollary of your own principle.
I understand. So the reason why that's different is that if you're claiming that states chose to opt into these kinds of systems, these are often states many, many years ago, right? So people living today did not choose that, like they wanted their states to opt into the United Nations. I also think that there's certain democratic barriers of how these like ratification processes ultimately worked, especially when historically states were not democratic. Whereas when it comes to like individual policies, you have a lot more lobbying power that ultimately exists. I also think that if too many states are opting into organizations, you then kind of create a vacuum effect where you're going to experience economic disadvantage if you're like the one country is not in the WTO, and if there's some kind of like coercive drain. Why then, secondly, on the Prague, why are buy into moral systems like higher under our side of the house? So people right now are just like, there's a rejection of notions of trying to enforce levels of universal moralities, right? Number one, it's just not reflective of actual lived experiences and belief systems. While you can attempt to persuade everyone that universal morality is correct, it's very, very difficult when there are things like distinct kinds of experiences. But secondly, it's often perceived as being uniquely hegemonic and colonial in nature, particularly when this is often created by Western powers in the past who happen to have the most power, and therefore it's seen as being an imposition over values that often mirrors things like historical traumas of the past. I think an op response could be the system can adapt, but the problem is moral systems that are created tend to be uniquely self-reinforcing in nature. This is because it's hard to challenge things like international laws, because doing so is going to result in punishment over that exact same moral framework when it comes to forms of prosecution, forms of trade sanctions that ultimately exist. I think that our moral systems are a lot more adaptable because you do not trap people and things like regional laws to a large extent. There's different kinds of like moral systems that exist, and therefore you can get the sharing of different kind of components of that without having the punishment, because there are different ones that you're ultimately able to opt into. Under our side of the house, regional organizations are still likely to form because if there is global sentiment toward a thing at a particular point in time, i.e. we need the United Nations to guard against forms of global abuses, that exact same sentiment is going to exist, but you're just going to get the regionalization of those kinds of systems. There are also things like advantages of cooperation at the local level when it comes to things like better economic policies. Why though our systems are a lot better? Firstly, we're less likely to get an outright rejection of these systems. These are countries who are currently pulling out of the ICC because it's seen as being a bad organization and who are actively opting out, as people who are just rejecting notions of human rights codes in the first place because they perceive these systems as being bad. Even if op can prove that their moral systems are better, we get more people opting into them under our side of the house. Secondly, people engage more within the systems that they're in. Even if outright rejection is implausible, you get things like more funding and capitalization of regional organizations, actually referring things like people who commit human rights abuses within your own state to regional courts when you perceive them as being morally legitimate, and complying with like agreements of like sending people via those like agreements when they exist, right? When there's localized health organizations, more buy into actually trusting protocols rather than like the WHO that's perceived as being fundamentally hegemonic. But finally, global organizations are mired by gridlock. You cannot get consensus over the kind of things that you want. The UN and most organizations get nothing done because the only way to prevent people from opting out are to have consensus-based mechanisms, meaning that there's huge kinds of gridlock. Once again, at the very least, regional organizations, if they are worse, get comparatively more policy passed and things done at the regional level. For all these reasons, I'm very proud to stand in opening government.
I thank the speaker very much for that speech. I now call upon the opposition leader to open their team's case. And again, just a reminder, be switched on.
Hi, am I like, audible?
Yeah, all good now.
Thank you. Okay. I just want to make a couple of observations before we get into my speech proper. The first observation being that this is a prefers debate. We need a counterfactual of some kind. I think Naomi has given you some reasons to believe that our counterfactual is actually likely, rather than only bilateral negotiations and deals forming. We think it is likely that some countries might also choose to opt into regional agreements. I don't think this is, hugely unreasonable or anything. The second thing I want to note is that counterfactuals tend to start at a certain point. Here's where our certain point is going to be starting. Most international institutions were formed after World War II. The reason for these international institutions forming after World War II was because there was global conflict, poverty, and instability, and so they set up a myriad of institutions to try and address each of these problems separately, right? So you have the UN trying to do things with global governance, and you have like the WTO trying to do things with the economy. The ideal, of course, is always that this would be non-politicized, but I think I'm going to show you that in reality, there's no way to create international institutions of this kind without any kind of politicization creeping in. Why is this context actually kind of important? Firstly, because I think in whatever counterfactual world we're going to have, the norms that you group around in bilaterally or multilaterally would be similar, because all these countries are emerging from the same context of global war that has absolutely rocked their foundations, which means if opening opposition wants to hinge their hat on the low-hanging branch of genocide is bad, we kind of agree. I think most countries after World War II would also agree that genocide is bad and probably impose some kinds of norms within their region to maybe not have genocide. Second of all, I just think that when you have a counterfactual world that's starting in like the 40s or 40s, a lot of the efficiency arguments from opening opposition just don't matter anymore. The reason why they don't matter anymore is because, first of all, it's hilarious to think that the United Nations is in any way efficient, but also because the United Nations, whatever we think of it now, was absolutely inefficient when it first started up. Therefore, we think, given a similar trajectory of development, our norms and institutions and bilateral ties would also develop in a way to cut out quite a lot of these efficiency harms that opening opposition mentions. Okay, so that's the characterization. I just want to quickly deal with some of the opening opposition material before going on to some of mine. Okay, the first is this claim that the United Nations or global institutions are good because they can stop war crimes of various kinds, such as genocide. First of all, I think that for every kind of thing that an international institution has intervened in, it has probably sat on the sidelines for 10 more. The United Nations makes war in order to have peace. And very often when there are genocides going on in the world, sits on the sideline on its arse without doing absolutely anything at all. The reason for this is quite simple. I think, number one, there are certain uncontroversial cases that don't match any kind of politicized, interest, and therefore that's when the UN can act. Those instances are few and far between, and I think this is true for most international institutions. The problem comes where you actually have cases which different countries disagree on how to act over, and in those cases, the result is often inaction, costing many more lives than the lives that opening opposition are claiming they save. The second thing they claim is that you can opt out of these institutions if you don't like them, and they like just give some examples of this. The first thing I would point out is that the barriers of opting out are actually quite high, and they often and you often opt out after multiple harms have been accrued to you, not before. So we would prefer you have a world where you are able to specifically pick what kinds of bilateral ties you opt into with a much clearer conception of what you're getting yourself into, rather than opting into international institutions as a whole, where you then have no say about what goes on within those politicized echo chambers that are how international decisions get made. The second thing to note here is that I just think it's easier to opt out in that there are fewer barriers when you're opting out of bilateral or multilateral agreements, just because the replacements you are able to get are much easier. Last of all, okay, no, this bad weapons thing, I think I've already dealt with. Okay, so 2 points for you. First of all, on politicization. Second of all, on control. So first of all, Naomi tells you a lot of things about why it's important that you get a more buy-in to human rights codes and norms on our side. Opening opposition tries to claim that you would, without this, everybody would just use sarin gas and nuclear weapons everywhere. First of all, I just think that's quite unlikely, given the fact that mutually assured destruction, as well as other kinds of principles in war, are still likely to arise given countries' quite natural self-interests. Second of all, I think that global governance will always privilege the rich. Why? Primarily because global institutions have no other sources of funding. This means that they rely only on whatever funding they're able to get of governments, whether we like it or not. The kinds of countries that are able to exert leverage over global institutions are always going to be the countries that have benefited most from the current global system. The second thing to add here is that this is also bad because it prioritizes the interests of certain rich countries and essentially centers and frames them as the global community's interest just because of the fact they can fund them. Third of all, it means that punishments are always targeted against less powerful countries. So for instance, you can specifically wield and weaponize international institutions in order to advance your own political interests. Consider the kinds of pushing for liberalization that opening opposition talks about, where they talk a lot of things about free trade and capital flow, despite the fact that this is actually really bad for certain countries with developing industries. Or for instance, let's look at the ICC prosecuting certain countries but letting the war crimes of the US go completely unpunished. There's a reason for all of this, and I think this politicization is actually inherent to the system and is much more easily avoided when you are bilateral or multilateral. Why? Because first of all, the power dynamics within your region usually tend to be more equal than the power dynamics of small countries against large global hegemons. Second of all, I'm going to take a point of information from CO. But most of the things I've said actually apply to bilateral institutions. Our case is not contingent on multilateral institutions like ASEAN, because all the analysis I've given you about why international institutions are bad still apply, as well as all the incentives about power dynamics that occur within countries, again, with bilateral institutions, they still apply. Second of all, let's talk about principles and control over policies. I think Naomi gives you a lot of reason about this. I'm just going to add that power tends to ossify and prevent most countries from being ever able to challenge the most privileged countries, and it reinforces the fact that their interests are the same as global interests, and there are a lot of coercive structures that prevent you from living. How does this actually weigh up in this debate? I think, first of all, we are the team that shows you that international organizations cement a creation of a global hierarchy that's incredibly hard to break out of, whereas it's much easier on bilateral sides. Second of all, we tell you that bilateral things can be efficient, whereas international organizations often aren't. Third of all, Naomi gives you excellent material about national sovereignty and why you should be able to have some manner of leverage over your government rather than have your lives dictated by policy you have no say over. Incredibly proud to propose.
I thank the speaker very much for that speech. I now call upon the Deputy Opposition Leader to continue for opening opposition. Hear, hear.
Just checking that I'm audible.
Yes, you are.
Then just before starting my speech, I will be taking a POI from closing at approximately 5:30. Please have a POI ready. And also I would like to thank Marta for, speaking here with me. This has been incredibly fun. I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, there is a problem with side government, which is we agree that no one is going to hold the United States, Russia, and China accountable on either side of the house. They're right. These countries are just too powerful to control on our side, on their side, sure. What they're ignoring is Marta's analysis that explains that when you have an agreement that everyone must conflate on, this creates certain standards that then across the middle of the spectrum creates norms and laws that everyone else must abide by. Sure, this means that the United States, Russia, and China get slightly more power in these institutions. It means that the US can kind of get away with not joining the ICC and therefore not being held accountable by those laws. We agree. That just doesn't change because in the counterfactual, what happens is you have bilateral agreements, which then disproportionately empower those stronger countries against comparatively weaker countries in ways that is less likely to happen when the interests of those three large powers actually create incentives for them to safeguard their own satellites against the other international superpowers. What do I mean by this? There is an interest for the United States to make sure that Israel is not being screwed over by international policy. There is an interest for China for its satellites to not be targeted by international scrutiny. There's an interest for Russia to not have like Syria and like its other subsidiary satellites being influenced by international power, meaning there are certain norms that all of these three are going to ensure apply across the spectrum, regardless of which actor, regardless of which country we're talking about, regardless of which one we interact with. Additionally, it also creates norms that are more likely to interact, and safeguard certain laws. Because if you have a bilateral agreement that says that the United States, Russia, and China agree not to nuke each other, that doesn't mean that they have bilateral agreements that ensure that they don't, for instance, nuke, I don't know, Iran, right? There's absolutely no guarantee on side government that creates an agreement that is confluent for everyone in all periods of time, in all countries, no matter in which they live. Notice that this is something that you can kind of, like, I'm kind of stealing this idea from the animal kingdom, but like when a bunch of ravens get together to kill an eagle, this is called mobbing. When you get a lot of smaller actors getting together in order to take down a larger one, this is far more likely to occur when you're in a framework that a priori enables you to actually engage in this kind of setting where you have a more fair equivalency of internationally distributed power. This is not as likely to happen if you have a lot of bilateral agreements. This is the counterfactual that side government needs to agree with. I also understand that obviously if you have enough bilateral agreements, this is kind of what opening government is getting at, then you effectively get an international standard. But here's where they actually ignore Marta's analysis, because what Marta tells you is that each of those individual bilateral agreements is one that is always going to disproportionately favor the stronger actor within the setting. Notice additionally also that this doesn't then safeguard actors that are like, for instance, when Saudi Arabia and Yemen interact with each other, then this agreement will not be safeguarded by the fact that the United States and Saudi Arabia have an agreement, because that does not transfer one to the other. And this is the critical distinction for why we need a generally applicable norm that holds true regardless of the context. let's then deal with the rest that opening government tells us, because I think there's like just a lot of stuff that does require some responses that isn't just whether or not bilateral is preferable. They tell us there is some inherent illegitimacy to the fact that we don't have moral autonomy over the laws we make. Several things. Marta already explains to you that you don't need to sign on to these if you don't like them. Enting responds to this by saying, but it is easier to opt out of a bilateral agreement than it is to opt out of a non-bilateral agreement. One, that also means that it's easier to opt out if you no longer want to maintain the human rights violations, according to that logic. And two, and more importantly, most countries actually do need to keep more to the standard on their side of the house. Why is that so? Because you're only as good as your word is in that kind of world, because there is no standard enforcing any of these norms from outside. They say, you don't need an international policeman. Well, when there's no international policeman and you have an order of international anarchy and no one holds anyone accountable, then the only thing that's actually holding you accountable is the word you gave, meaning that presumably to some extent that is actually symmetrical. Notice, however, more importantly, that the vast majority of countries actually do choose to not opt in a priori. Note that, for instance, when we sign international laws, these are usually things that are then not signed by the countries that don't want to opt into them. That's, for instance, why some countries still use phosphor bombs, because they didn't sign on when the Geneva Convention started being expanded to that. We think then on that comparative, it is unclear to us why it is so important that they don't opt in after the fact or why they opt out after the fact. The only thing we think actually demonstrably changes on either side of this debate, because a lot of this is like essentially symmetrical when we're talking about the most powerful actors, is to what extent we can hold the medium powers accountable to one another. And that's the primary distinction we make on this. We don't think there's anyone in this debate who has the fiat to actually claim that anyone has the power to like control the major actors. Before I continue, does closing have something? 3, 2, 1, opening.
So given that you think medium actors are being held accountable, how exactly are actors like Egypt, for instance, or Libya actually being held accountable for any of their actions?
They're being held accountable by the fact that if they break international law in certain factions, for instance, on trade, then they're getting sanctions placed on them by the international community. They're being held accountable by the fact that when they break human rights violations, then they, like Libya did under Gaddafi, then an international alliance of countries goes in and demolishes them. I have no idea why in your conflation of like bilateral agreements on mutually agreed upon agreements, this occurs at all. Notice, for instance, that the probably most accurate counterfactual in this debate for side government is presumably actually as they themselves claim, the pre-World War II norms in which we had bilateral agreements. We had mutual defense agreements where countries agreed to come to each other's aid in case of war. This then is actually what caused a lot of both world wars, in fact, to spiral into exactly that, because one country had an agreement with another country, had an agreement with another country, had an agreement with another country, which then actually made it disproportionately more likely that two countries that didn't happen to be in the same alliance just agreed to go to war with each other, which then snowballed and spiraled into additional countries coming to each other's aid. This is less likely to have when you have overreaching broad alliances that a priori make clear who is with who and who is fighting with whom, and to make clear that who you don't go to war with. If the metric in this debate is that presumably we all don't agree to certain moral frameworks, then I'm unclear as to why I actually care whether or not these countries are in these kinds of frameworks. Note finally, though, and this is actually kind of just interesting to me, at the point at which I don't understand why it is that international law actually causes any of the direct damages that government bench tells me, I'm unclear why I care if it exists. It is unclear to me why international law specifically causes the moral damages, given that presumably people who voted for Donald Trump and now are represented by Joe Biden still are, to be held accountable by the laws of the United States. Proud to stand in opposition.
I thank the speaker very much for that speech and note that that concludes the top half of this debate. To extend the case for the closing government, I invite the government member. Here.
I'd like for people to POI me by turning on their videos and waving. I do not check the chat. If I, for some reason, am not seeing you because there are a lot of people in this Zoom call, feel free to unmute yourself and say POI close to 5. Don't disrupt me earlier than then. Actually, I'm just gonna pin. Where should I pin? I'll pin.
You can hide non-video participants, I think, and then everyone without. There's a button to hide non-video participants, if I remember where it is. Oh, okay, it's not showing, sorry.
Okay, that's fine. I'll take CO at some point as a TLDR. I've pinned Tim, so If he turns on his video, I will respond to him. The OG case is super marginal because it's a comparative between regional ways of enforcing laws and international ways of enforcing laws. The problem is, judges, I'm sure you also found this annoying, that they say we can do some good things because obviously we're incented to do so, but none of the bad things because, you know, it's convenient for us. On CG, we're gonna beat them by biting the bullet. Yes, international norms and laws have massive benefits that we can't replicate. They facilitate greater interaction between countries, but our case is gonna be that globalization is shit and it's a massive and awful harm. GDP per capita and HDI across the entire continent of Africa is much lower now than 30 years ago after colonialism ended. 2, the IMF has left entire countries ridden in cyclical debt. I agree that the OU case is beautifully constructed and heart-wrenching, but at the end of the day, harms of conflict are, even though they're more visible, the human cost is much, much higher when you look at the prolonged poverty the international globalization facilitated uniquely by international law has plunged entire continents into. 2 reasons why. The first is it's much, much less localized, which means that it applies to a broad swathe of land and hurts many, many more people. But second of all, because it's permanent, i.e., once you're poor, this enters a cycle of poverty that means you perpetually are in suffering as opposed to humanitarian crisis, which though severe, begins to heal in time. Okay, so let's dive into my extension. The first thing I'm going to give you is I'm going to examine the origin of international institutions and laws and explain why, by virtue of how they were born and the structure that they have, they're exploitative. This is going to be important for 2 reasons. First, because it proves the harm I just flagged just now, but second of all, because I actually think that this bit of characterization is winning for the debate, because all teams are going to say that there are some bad things and some good things that these international institutions are going to do. Our characterization of how they were built and what their interests are is going to prove why the bad will always outweigh the good. Intuitive reasons why they're really bad is, trivially, they were created by Western countries. Let's note that these Western countries did not have positive incentives when they were writing this. First of all, this was built a long time ago, and people were incredibly racist and thought that people from other parts of the world should not have a say in the laws that govern them at all. But the second main thing is just that this was built in a period of time where the world was in intense conflict, i.e., the IMF is a weapon of the USA in order to fight the Cold War. It's a militant designed to crush, not help. But second of all, beyond this painful and gory start, why are the inequalities and exploitative mechanisms self-perpetuating and get worse, not better over time? We need to think about the mechanisms of survival and how these institutions perpetuate themselves. There are 2 ways that these international organizations pay for themselves. The first is literally profit. Like, the IMF is not a nice NGO. It literally earns money by bailing out countries, forcing them to end up in cycles of debt and extracting the interest over long periods of time. But second of all, they use membership fees. And that's important because richer countries always pay more, which is the reason why these international institutions are always in the pocket of the richest and most powerful countries. 2 more mechs why inequalities are self-perpetuating. 1, it forces low tariffs. That's good for established businesses and bad for industries, which perpetuates inequality. But finally, nobody can get enough power to overturn this, given the dominance that the USA already has. Okay, so that's why things are really, really shit. I'm now going to explain the second part of my extension, which is about why, in the absence of these international laws and organizations, their world would be much, much better. The first reason for this is just because there's way less international interaction. This is especially true given that the other teams in the right have decided to go super, super hard line and said that the counterfactual is limited not to regional blocks at all, but rather bilateral deals and not regional ideas. Why is that really, really bad? Because the benefit of international laws is that they create a norm, i.e., I know that if some country shafts me, that means that the international organization is going to come after them and punish them, for example. That's useful for business, right? Because it means that countries face less risk when interacting with one another, constructing trade deals, buying and selling, having immigration, so on and so forth. This prisoner's dilemma is unresolved on our side of the house, and therefore globalization is substantially more diffuse. But 2, another reason for this is just because it streamlines and normalizes international interaction, which again, we destroyed. Tin, I'll take you through impact this. What's the impact of this? 2 things. The first is the bar for MNCs to move to different countries is much, much, much higher, which means that we have far, far fewer of these international conglomerates, but 2, it's just impossible to coordinate military efforts quite trivially. Before I explain my unbalance, this all means that there's less suffering taking up at their best. I'll take you, CO.
This House prefers a world's motion involve analysing the likely historical counterfactual that would have to occur for your side to actually come into place. What is the likely historical counterfactual in which no country ever decides to enter a multilateral agreement?
Wait, didn't you literally POI that regional and multilateral agreements aren't part of this debate to ending? But also, I guess I can also give you some reasons why it's less likely to be abusive if it's regional. The reason for this is because when the AU exists and the US negotiates with them, the power asymmetry is substantially lower. And that's the body which governs decisions and regulates interactions, as opposed to the IMF as opposed to everything going back to the IMF. Second main response is, yes, I know there could be some harms, but I think the IMF and recent trends have been uniquely bad, and I think that globalization is substantially less on your side. Okay, final claim then is why on balance there is much less suffering at the end of the day. The first thing I want to say is just that the OO benefits from humanitarian buy-in are extremely low. The first reason is because, as OO themselves say, as a benefit, that international rules and organizations are an opt-in system, which means if I choose not to join the ICC in order to commit war crimes, nothing happens to me. Why is it really, really bad? For two reasons. The first thing is, at the end of the day, the thing preventing atrocities is always equal power. That is, that I cannot do this because I knew that I'm at equal risk of being vulnerable. On the other hand, in some cases, there are asymmetric conflicts where a massive actor is fucking up a small actor, yes. But on either side of the house, no one can stop this because these big actors have so much of a death grip over control within these international organizations. A great example is how nobody is doing fuck all about Uyghurs in Xinjiang. Nobody is doing anything about Russians' annexation of Crimea. That's because they have a stranglehold over these situations, and they always will in these cases. The final thing I'm going to say is that international capitalism, therefore, is the only change to the debate because violence cannot be helped. And I think it just does more harm than good because we're willing to bite the bullet of slower growth because we think that's much, much more acceptable than the agony that increased interconnectedness has created. The first is because you have an active drain of resources from one part of the world to the other as opposed to more insular, isolated economies. But second of all, because I also just think that we're much, much less specialized and therefore prone to being fucked by global recession and crisis. Very proud to propose.
I thank the speaker very much for that speech. I now call upon the opposition member to extend the case for closing opposition. Hear, hear.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Cool. In that case, I will start in 3, 2, 1. Third debate at this tournament where teams miss the counterfactual. I am abjectly sad. So what is the counterfactual crash course in the debating manual? When we have it, this house prefers a world motion. The question prior to that motion is what kind of conditions would yield that world? Therefore, the first thing that we have to analyze is what were the conditions that yielded multilateral organizations, and as a corollary, what would have been a world which would never have yielded multilateral organizations? Three things. What kind of world creates multilateral organizations? First of all, one in which there is a security dilemma. There is a relative balance of power in which multiple countries know that they have similar levels of power to other countries, therefore can never be sure that they can overpower them, but also can therefore never be sure that these countries are not plotting an attack against them, not necessarily just in terms of conflict, but in terms of things like economic sanctions, trade wars, and diplomatic exclusion. This means that in that world, it's beneficial to form multilateral agreements because insofar as you cannot preempt the risk of these countries invading you, and if they band against you, they're stronger than you because of the a priori balance of power, it is more beneficial for you to tie their existence to your existence and make you multi-dependent on each other. This is risky in and of itself. So this is something that only happens if this is a lower risk than the other one, which is the risk of you potentially being assaulted by another country, which is why you enter into this agreement in the first place, both to derive benefits, but also to create multi-dependency, which means you're unlikely to be assaulted. Secondly, this is a world in which there is at least a basic alignment and agreement on certain interests and norms. First of all, this enables diplomacy, which means in general that countries are able to negotiate their interests without going into conflict. But secondly, it means there's an agreement on generalized norms about morality, things like human rights being something which we believe to be prior to any other political relationship, things like sovereignty being an extension of these human rights, which also flips the OG principle, because the idea of sovereignty being agreed upon by countries was the prerequisite for multilateral organizations to form, and therefore also the prerequisite for decolonization to happen and be both legally and militarily enforced if necessary. Thirdly, this is a world where there's competition for influence. Insofar as it is a multipolar world, this means that you cannot achieve your supremacy through military means. This therefore means you have to draw countries to your sphere of influence through soft power. You have to offer them trade. You have to offer them infrastructure, because if you don't, the other bloc is incredibly likely to do that. A good example of this is the Cold War with two large multilateral organizations which did the same thing, which is why you got the growth that XK wants to talk about in Africa. A good example of the idea of balance of power is the European coal and steel community, which was really founded for that reason. What is the corollary and the flip side of that? First of all, it's a world where there is a priori a domination of one or incredibly small amount of forces. A world where countries are certain that they have a sufficient amount of power that they can resist any kind of outside assault, and therefore do not have to risk their sovereignty to become interdependent. This is therefore a world essentially of colonialism, a world where countries can perpetuate their dominance through military means, a world where countries exploit others by stealing their resources and leaving them downtrodden, as happened to the countries in Africa and Asia. A world where even if those leaders have the best incentives, which I'm not sure that they have, they are far removed from the people they are leading at the end of the day, because they have prior obligations and prior knowledge about their countries, not those they're colonizing at the other end of the world. Colonization and colonialism was literally a world of bilateral agreements, the type of which opening government and closing government have to stand for in this debate. The response to closing government is therefore, it's a world where colonialism never ended. Secondly, it's a world with no basic level of alignment about general norms. The consequence of this is that there is no diplomacy between countries, and there is no even basic level of agreement for them to begin diplomacy. This means it's a world of constant conflict in terms of both wars and economic conflict, which means that a lot of people just die, and this seems to be bad. But thirdly, this is also a world with less competition for soft power influence and a lower amount of norms that are centered around the fact that sovereignty is an extension of individual rights, which means that the African countries in the developing world that closing government cares about never became independent in the first place, insofar as that was not a necessity for the Western powers in terms of projecting their soft power, because they would just keep them under their yoke. The prerequisite for them not being able to do that was a balance of power, where going into these countries might provoke a war, as it did in World War I and World War II, and therefore necessitated the creation of multilateral organizations. The problem with both government teams is that they assume that the counterfactualists would just erase UN today and would just replace it with bilateral agreements. The counterfactualists prior to that, it's a world where there is an equal amount of Western dominance, these bilateral agreements being created by the West on either side of the house, but no incentive to offer countries benefits in terms of soft power, and no balancing mechanisms which necessitate the creation of organizations which will provide these benefits in terms of trade and provide these benefits in terms of securing norms and independence. This is logically prior to anything closing government says, and then missing the counterfactual unfortunately makes them lose the final. I will now have fun with the opening government principle and also prove why our side of the motion is principally legitimate. Multiple responses here. First of all, note that this decision to join multilateral organizations is fundamentally sovereign. There was no overt coercion to join the European Union. Some countries choose to stay out of it. For example, Serbia. The fact that the reason why they joined was a reason of soft power. What does soft power mean? It means the countries perceived utility in joining this union. They are likely to get more trade, and they are likely to get more protection. This means that a priori, the metric for this decision was not a metric of coercion, but rather of utility, congruent with the open government principle of agency. But secondly, it amplifies agency insofar as very often joining these organizations, and the reason why you join them is a prerequisite for having more tools to exercise your agency. Therefore, we get more of that principle. I have more fun reasons, but I won't have time for myself to explain them. So before they're going to take opening.
Okay, listen, countries literally fought wars to get out of colonialism. You can't just say that we have to defend a world where colonialism still exists, because those incentives to fight wars still exist. But also the international institutions were a way for countries like in the West to keep projecting power to continue the economic colonialism that we see today.
They did fight wars. They also had allies in the form of multilateral organizations who sanctioned those who fought wars against them. This is a necessity of our case, not of yours. I'm sorry. Multiple other responses. Secondly, note the way in which state power works. State power works in a ventriloquist mechanism. This means that you delegate asymmetric power to representatives who then, without your explicit consent for their every move, exercise this power in your own interests. So the consequence of the opening government case is that either their own counterfactual is immoral, insofar as every delegation of power is immoral, or it's moral by necessity, because insofar as in opening government counterfactual, they have to defend the principle of delegating power to state representatives, and those representatives then decided through the mandate vested in them by delegation to join multilateral organizations by opening government's own definition. This decision is legitimate, and specifically because there is no universal metric of morality, we can only defer to subjective morality, which in opening government's own counterfactual they have to defend is the delegation of power. But note thirdly, safety is prior to autonomy. Multilateral organizations offer things like NATO Article 5, like the UN Security Council, and numerous norms which prevent conflict. Insofar as the prevention of conflict is necessary for autonomy, this decision was necessary for a principle to exist in the first place. This means not only that OG is out, but secondly, that insofar as we have no knowledge of objective morality as per government's own metric, which CG has to follow, the only morality we can defer to is the preference of the people themselves. Insofar as we prove that we fulfill that within government's own metric, we win this debate on the principle and not just on the practical. I'm very happy to see how Matt Hazel will strawman this, but Reese will be very happy to deal with that. So closing government wins.
I thank the speaker very much for that speech. Now to conclude the government portion of the debate, I call upon the government whip. Hear, hear.
Alrighty, let's get this over with. Okay, can you hear me?
Yep, all good.
Right. It's a big call for Tin to accuse me of straw manning when he managed to simultaneously straw man the world's judging manual, every This House Prefers debate I've ever been in, and pretty much the foundations of logic. Because let's just deal with what his big first push is. Basically what he says is, look, a This House Prefers debate requires there to exist a counterfactual that is different from the status quo. Yes, I agree. Therefore, you must justify what the preconditions that would be to create that world. No, that's not in the manual. Bold of you to tell the world's CA who just rewrote the manual what she wrote in it. But why does it not say that? Because here's the problem. Let's pick a different debate. Let's go meta. This house prefers a world where, I don't know, humans can't feel fear. How the fuck did humans evolve when they didn't have fear? How did the primates not get eaten by the little fishies? Did a switch happen? Nobody knows. The whole point of This House Prefers debate is to say a different status quo exists. Let's discuss whether it's preferable. Because the second problem with this is that there are clearly an infinite number of alterations that could have had to humanity that would have led to the same set of outcomes. Maybe the reason we didn't have these international organizations post-World War II is because there was no World War II. Maybe the reason there was no World War II is because, I don't know, humans just evolved in a way that meant they had no desire for conflict in the first place. We all live in the Tower of Babel, whatever. The problem is that this is entirely recursive. And like Ron does quantum physics, so he should know that the problem is that even if you know a defined endpoint, you can't definitively say exactly what every single like preceding event would have been if there are multiple possible routes that can end up as a single event. So most of what he says about, oh, we must defend a world where colonialism exists is transparently nonsense in the basis of simple logic. So all of that can fuck right off. The second thing he says is that we must give a plausible counterfactual, but we did, and OG did, and OO accepted it, and that was fine, right? And you POI'd them and said, aha, your counterfactual can't include regional alternatives, and we all said, okay, fine, no, it won't. So what's your problem, right? We have bilateral organizations between multiple countries giving little bilateral treaties to each other, which means that in a large part, we don't have regional blocks, sorry, OG, but we also don't have international blocks. But there are still incentives to do lots of the things that achieve many of the same goals as international treaties do, such as not wantonly committing genocide, because there are many reasons not to commit genocide. It's not just a piece of paper, it's that usually it backfires on you in the long run when people start doing it back to you, right? We didn't have a treaty that says, by the way, I promise I won't nuke you, America, or I promise I won't nuke you, Russia. Just neither of them did it because they knew it would be spectacularly stupid in the long run. So colonialism, like not relevant in the way that he says it, but where it is relevant is in what Schalke says in their extension, which is to say that actually colonialism stopped happening in a large part because they just ran out of resources. Because after World War II, like Britain didn't suddenly wake up one day and be, you know what, maybe Gandhi's right. Maybe we shouldn't just pointlessly oppress this entire country that's making us loads of money. No, instead they realized that they didn't have the capacity to do it anymore. And whether the IMF existed or not, that lack of capacity would have existed either way. So instead what they did and what the Americans did in order to prevent, I mean, it's literally written into the IMF's charter that the main reason for it existing is to stop communism existing and stop communist ideology, was to push their values and their norms and exploit countries rather than through military force, which they were no longer able to do because these other countries were better armed and they'd spent all their money, and that's really fucking expensive to do and deeply unpopular at home when all of your people are dying in pointless wars you're not getting anything out of. They tried to exploit them instead through fiscal means. And this is what Schalke talked about when she talked about the way that IMF has used things like structural adjustments programs, which have left many countries in Latin America, many countries in Africa stuck in cyclical debt that has lasted for 30, 40, 50 years, which has put millions of people in poverty, which is very directly led to, like, even if we want to do simple maths, like if you raise the infant mortality rate by, like, I don't know, 10%, that is a huge number of people who have died as a result of the fact that you have not properly funded your hospitals. So I think the ability of rich countries to leverage these organizations, to leverage globalization, to exploit them, has caused a huge amount of death and suffering in a way that you just chose not to respond to. And it is certainly indeed too late to respond to that in the whip speech. So next, let's talk a little bit more about opening government, because as we said, probably the regional stuff, I think, you know, it's a confusing motion, but I do think the regional stuff probably is also clearly under international law because these are founded by treaties that involve more than two countries. It's fair for closing op to point that out, and indeed opening op. So the principal stuff does, well, the practical stuff about regional blocks doesn't work. The principal stuff doesn't work because all they basically say is, like, the greater, the larger the group that I, you know, give up some of my rights to, that is bad because I lose some control on my ability to change it and blah, blah, blah. They said the word epistemic a few times. The problem here is very clear, right? If I give up my rights to a national government, still, that is a different set of morality to the one I subscribe to. That is still me giving up a bunch of rights to a larger hegemon. Yes, maybe an international group is a bigger and larger and scarier, but you know, your principle seems relatively absolute, that it is bad to give up rights. Okay, you're still giving up a bunch of rights in a bilateral treaty. So none of that really is relevant. And you didn't weigh the extent to which partially violating this principle would be better. So why are these norms so bad? Why is globalization so bad? For all the reasons that Schalke gave you. But before we talk about them a little bit more, let's go on 00.
The Uyghur genocide happens on both sides of the house. Can you explain to me why there is any delta at all in this debate, given that the principle is symmetric and or at least we defend some weaker countries on our side of the house?
I mean, maybe the Uyghur genocide happens, but I don't see why the US would be sort of throwing white phosphorus at Afghani children if it wasn't for the you know, the financial globalization incentives of that. Like domestic ones, sure. And like trivially, we don't fix everything. But the entire point of what Schalke was saying is that clearly some things did happen as a result of the IMF saying, well, I'm sorry, but we're going to strip mine your country and there's nothing you can do about it because all the environmental legislation is stuff that doesn't really exist. But now actually we do care about the environment. All of these rich countries who've already developed, yeah, good for them, happy days. But all of these poorer countries who would quite like to pollute the environment at least a little bit are somehow not allowed to pollute even their own countries, are not allowed to make the choices that would benefit their own people because someone somewhere in America has decided that they are not allowed to do so. So the general claim here is that yes, clearly, obviously bad things happen, but it's not like your international law fix it. I mean, literally the example you gave, right? Srebrenica was like, why did that happen? Because the UN did a really fucking shit job and the Dutch did a shit job because they were trying to abide by international law at the whole time. So it's not like you actually fix these problems in the first place. So ultimately then, what are we left with at the end of the debate? I'll be honest, guys, it wasn't the clearest motion. But what we are left with is the idea that globalization is deeply damaging to millions of people across the world, has caused countless death and countless suffering. And even if we mitigate that to like trivial extent, that is much more suffering we alleviate than possibly being able to hold someone to account 20 years later in The Hague after the massacre has already happened. So propose.